Aisha had always been the good daughter. At 25, her whole life in Nairobi revolved around keeping her family happy. Every morning she woke up early to cook breakfast before work, cleaned the house after everyone left, helped pay the bills, and made sure her younger siblings stayed in school. She never complained. She thought love meant sacrifice, and for years she gave everything she had. But one evening, everything changed. It started with a small argument over dinner. Her mother asked about her job, and when Aisha mentioned she wanted to change careers, her mother's face hardened. "You think you know better than us now," she snapped. Aisha tried to explain, her voice trembling, that she just wanted to do something for herself. But before she could finish, her mother shouted the words that would break her completely. "If you don't like it here, then never come back." The room went silent. Her siblings stared. Aisha stood frozen, the weight of years pressing down on her chest. She had done everything right, and still it wasn't enough. Tears blurred her vision as she realized her loyalty, her efforts, her love. None of it mattered. Without saying another word, she walked to her small room, folded a few clothes into a bag, and zipped it quietly. She looked around one last time, at the walls that had heard her laughter and her pain, then walked out into the cold Nairobi night. No shouting, no goodbye. Just silence. For the first time, Aisha chose herself. Aisha found a small room on the edge of the city, just one window, a thin mattress, and peeling paint on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The first night, she sat on the floor surrounded by her few belongings, staring at the empty space. The silence was deafening. She could still hear her mother's voice echoing in her head. "If you don't like it here, then never come back." Those words replayed over and over until her chest ached. That night, she cried herself to sleep, the kind of tears that come from deep exhaustion and heartbreak. The mornings were harder. She woke up before sunrise, just like she used to at home. But this time there was no family to cook for, no one to share tea with. She forced herself to eat a slice of bread, washed her face, and went to work like nothing had changed. Her co-workers noticed the difference, the quiet in her voice, the tired look in her eyes. But whenever they asked, she just smiled and said she was fine. She didn't have the strength to tell the story. At night, she would sit by the window, counting coins from her small salary. Every shilling mattered. Rent, food, transport. She wrote everything down in a small notebook. Sometimes she skipped meals just to save a little extra. On weekends, she picked up extra shifts, cleaning offices or helping at a nearby shop. It wasn't easy, but there was something powerful in knowing she was standing on her own for the first time. The loneliness stayed, but it started to feel different. Instead of pain, it began to feel peaceful, like breathing after holding your breath for too long. She realized she no longer had to walk on eggshells or prove her worth to anyone. Her room was small, her meals simple, but every corner of that little space carried a kind of quiet freedom she had never known before. Some nights she still cried, not out of sadness, but out of release, letting go of all the years she had spent trying to be enough. Other nights, she dreamed of the life she wanted to build, a steady job, her own place, maybe even helping other girls like her one day. Bit by bit, Aisha started to heal. She stopped checking her phone for calls that never came. She stopped waiting for an apology that might never arrive. She learned to find comfort in her own company. It wasn't an easy beginning, but it was hers, raw, real, and painfully beautiful. In that tiny room, Aisha began to understand something she had never known before. Sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken. Sometimes it comes from walking away and choosing yourself, even if it hurts. Months passed, and life didn't get any easier for Aisha, but she was learning how to survive. Every morning, she woke up before sunrise, ironed her only clean uniform, and headed to her job as a receptionist at a small office. She greeted people with a smile, answered phones, and kept the front desk running smoothly. On the surface, she looked calm and professional, but inside, she was constantly battling exhaustion. When the clock struck 5, most people went home to rest, but Aisha's day was only halfway done. After work, she changed into her delivery jacket, tied her hair back, and climbed onto a borrowed motorbike. The city lights guided her through the busy streets of Nairobi as she delivered packages and food orders late into the night. Some days she barely had time to eat. Her hands ached from riding for hours, her back hurt from sitting too long, and her eyes stung from the dust and wind. But she refused to give up. Every shilling she earned mattered. Every ride brought her closer to freedom. There were nights she came home so tired that she didn't even have the energy to cook. She'd drink a cup of water, collapse on her bed, and whisper to herself, "One day this will all be worth it." Those small talks with herself kept her going when everything else felt too heavy. Her neighbors noticed her quiet strength. They saw her leave before dawn and return long after dark. No one knew the full story, but they admired her determination. Even when she was hungry or broke, Aisha carried herself with pride. She had learned to live with less comfort, less company, less noise. And in that simplicity, she found something she'd never had before: control over her own life. Her family, meanwhile, assumed she was struggling miserably. They whispered among themselves that she would eventually come back home, begging for forgiveness. But Aisha didn't. She had found a kind of power in her independence that she never wanted to lose. It wasn't easy, freedom rarely is, but it was real. As weeks turned into months, she started saving bit by bit. First a few coins, then a few notes. She opened a small savings account and promised herself never to touch it unless absolutely necessary. Seeing the balance grow, even slowly, filled her with quiet pride. For the first time, she wasn't living just to survive. She was building something for herself. Sometimes, on her way home after a long shift, she'd ride through the city lights and smile softly under her helmet. The wind on her face reminded her that she was free. Tired, yes, but free. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. Every struggle, every sleepless night, every sacrifice was shaping her into someone stronger. Aisha was no longer the girl who lived to please others. She was becoming the woman who could stand on her own, and that was worth every bit of pain. A year later, Aisha's life looked completely different. The endless nights of deliveries and early mornings at the office had finally paid off. She had grown tougher, smarter, and more confident. When she saw an online job posting for an assistant position at a tech company in Mombasa, something inside her told her to try. She applied, not expecting much, but a week later, she got a call inviting her for an interview. She saved up for a bus ticket and traveled overnight to Mombasa, nervous but hopeful. The office was modern and bright, filled with people who spoke confidently about ideas and innovation. During the interview, she talked about her journey, how she managed 2 jobs, learned basic computer skills on her own, and never stopped pushing forward. Mr. Lutuli, the company's manager, listened quietly. At the end, he smiled and said, "We need people with your kind of drive." Aisha walked out that day with a job offer in her hand. Moving to Mombasa felt like stepping into a new life. The air was warmer, the ocean close by, and for the first time in years, she felt light. She worked hard, arriving early, staying late, learning everything she could. Her focus and discipline caught everyone's attention, especially Mr. Lutuli's. Within months, he trusted her with more responsibilities. She handled clients, organized meetings, and even helped improve one of the company's projects. Then one morning, he called her into his office. "Aisha," he said, "we'd like you to manage your own project. You've earned it." She could hardly believe it. A promotion. A real step forward. Not luck, not pity, but something she had built with her own effort. With her new salary, Aisha decided it was time to find a place of her own. She walked through several neighborhoods before finding a small, sunny apartment near the beach. It had white walls, big windows, and the gentle sound of waves in the distance. When she signed the lease, she paused for a moment, staring at her name written in ink. That signature meant more than a home. It meant independence, peace, and self-worth. On her first night there, she unpacked slowly, placing her few belongings neatly around the room. The space was quiet, but not lonely. She brewed a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the sunset paint the sky in orange and gold. In that silence, Aisha smiled softly to herself. She wasn't the same girl who once cried herself to sleep in a tiny room, wondering if she'd made a mistake by leaving home. She had grown through pain, through struggle, through courage. She didn't need anyone's permission to be happy anymore. Her peace was hers alone, and this time, no one could take it away. Back in Nairobi, the house didn't feel the same anymore. At first, everyone thought Aisha would come back after a few days, maybe a week. Her mother even told the others, "Let her cool off, she'll return." But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks quietly became months. Aisha's room stayed empty, her bed neatly made, her clothes gone. The house, once filled with her laughter and the smell of her cooking, started to feel hollow. Her younger siblings felt it the most. They missed how she used to wake them up for school, help them with homework, or sneak them extra food when dinner wasn't enough. Without Aisha, mornings were rushed and quiet. The meals didn't taste the same, and no one checked on their schoolwork anymore. They whispered about her at night, wondering if she was okay, afraid to ask their mother about her. Their mother, on the other hand, buried herself in chores. She pretended not to notice the silence. Whenever someone mentioned Aisha's name, she'd change the subject or scold them for bringing it up. But at night, when everyone was asleep, she would open the drawer where she had hidden Aisha's old photos. She'd hold one in her hands, a picture of Aisha smiling in her graduation gown, and her eyes would fill with tears. Guilt sat heavy in her chest. She thought about that night, the words she had shouted in anger, words she could never take back. "If you don't like it here, then never come back." They echoed in her mind, haunting her. The father stayed quiet most of the time, pretending to be strong for everyone. But deep down, he missed Aisha too. She had always been the responsible one, the glue that held everything together. One evening, unable to bear the silence anymore, he picked up his phone and called her number. It rang and rang, but she didn't answer. He tried again a few days later, but still nothing. Aisha saw the missed calls. Her heart ached every time she looked at her phone, but she couldn't bring herself to pick up. She wasn't angry anymore, just not ready. The wounds were still too fresh. Back home, her mother started to soften. She began cooking Aisha's favorite meals, even though no one asked her to. Sometimes she'd set an extra plate on the table, only to quietly put it away when no one was looking. Her guilt turned into silence, and that silence spread through the whole house. The walls that once echoed with arguments now held only regret. The family began to realize how much Aisha had carried, her effort, her patience, her love. It took her absence for them to understand her worth. And though she was miles away, her presence lingered in every corner of that quiet, heavy home. It was a bright afternoon in Mombasa, and Aisha was busy at work, reviewing reports for her new project. The office buzzed with quiet chatter and the soft hum of computers. She was focused, sipping her tea when the receptionist walked over and said, "There's someone here to see you." Aisha frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she looked up and saw her younger brother, Malik, standing by the door, her heart skipped a beat. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, tired, and nervous. His shirt was wrinkled, and he was clutching a small bag. For a moment, Aisha couldn't move. It had been over a year since she'd seen anyone from home. She stood up slowly, her voice trembling. "Malik? What are you doing here?" He tried to smile, but his eyes gave him away. "Hi, Aish," he said softly, using the nickname he hadn't used in years. "I came straight from Nairobi. Mama isn't well." The words hung heavy in the air. Aisha felt her chest tighten. "What do you mean she isn't well?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. Malik looked down, rubbing his hands together. "She's been sick for weeks. The doctors say it's her blood pressure. But it's more than that. She doesn't eat, she barely sleeps. She keeps asking for you." Aisha's throat went dry. She turned away, pretending to fix some papers on her desk, but her hands were shaking. She had promised herself she'd never go back, not after everything that happened. She had built a new life, a peaceful one, and going back felt like opening an old wound she'd worked so hard to heal. But hearing Malik's voice, seeing the worry in his eyes, broke something inside her. Her mother had hurt her deeply, but she was still her mother. Aisha took a deep breath and asked quietly, "Is she really that bad?" Malik nodded. "She just sits in your room sometimes, talking to herself. I think she regrets everything, Aish. Please just come home, even if it's just for a little while." Aisha stared out the window, watching the waves crash in the distance. Memories flooded back, the laughter, the arguments, the night she walked out. She had carried that pain like a secret, letting it push her to become stronger. But now, faced with the thought of losing her mother, all that strength felt small. Finally, she turned to Malik and whispered, "Okay, I'll come." Relief washed over his face as he hugged her tightly, the way he used to when they were kids. Aisha held him back, her heart heavy with fear and love. That night, she packed a small bag, the same way she had when she left home. But this time, it felt different. She wasn't running away. She was going back. Not for forgiveness, not for closure, but because some goodbyes shouldn't be left unsaid. She had no idea that this visit would change everything. The bus ride back to Nairobi felt endless. Aisha sat by the window, watching the familiar roads blur past, her heart pounding with every mile. She hadn't been home in more than a year. The thought of seeing her mother again filled her with a mix of fear, anger, and something she couldn't name. Maybe love she had tried to bury. She clutched her small bag tightly, wondering if she was ready for what waited ahead. When the bus finally stopped near her old neighborhood, her legs felt weak. Everything looked the same: the dusty road, the smell of street food, the sound of children playing nearby. Yet, it all felt different, smaller somehow. She walked slowly toward the house she once called home, each step heavier than the last. Her brother opened the gate quietly. "She's outside," he whispered. Aisha nodded, her palms sweating. On the veranda, her mother sat in her usual chair, wrapped in a shawl. Her hair looked grayer, her body thinner. When she heard footsteps, she looked up, and for a long moment, they just stared at each other. The silence was thick, almost painful. 1,000 memories flashed between them: laughter, arguments, love, and heartbreak. Neither spoke. Then, her mother's lips began to tremble, and tears rolled down her cheeks. "Aisha," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I didn't think you'd come." Aisha swallowed hard, her eyes wet but steady. "Malik said you weren't well," she said quietly. Her mother nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "I was wrong, Aisha," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought pushing you away would make you stronger. I thought it would teach you to stand on your own. But I only pushed away my peace and my daughter." Her words came out between sobs, raw and full of regret. "Every day, I prayed you'd walk through that door. I told myself I was right, but deep down, I knew I'd broken something I couldn't fix. Aisha stood still, her heart twisting. For so long, she had dreamed of hearing those words, the apology she never thought would come. And now that it was here, she didn't know how to feel. The pain was still there, sitting quietly in her chest, but so was compassion. She walked closer, slowly, until she stood right in front of her mother. The older woman reached out a trembling hand, but Aisha didn't take it right away. She looked her mother in the eyes and said softly, "Now you know how my silence felt." Her mother broke down completely, covering her face with her hands, whispering her daughter's name over and over. Aisha sat beside her, not saying another word. The wind blew gently, rustling the trees, carrying away the tension that had lived between them for so long. They didn't need to talk anymore. The truth was already there, in the tears, in the silence, and in the fragile peace that had finally begun to grow between them. The days that followed were quiet but heavy. Aisha stayed at her parents' house for a short while, mostly to help her mother recover. She woke up early, cooked breakfast, and cleaned the kitchen just like she used to. But this time, there was a difference. She did it without expectation, without the old need for approval. Everyone noticed it. She moved through the house calmly, her presence steady and peaceful, yet there was a distance they could all feel. Her mother watched her closely, often with tearful eyes. She still tried to apologize now and then, but Aisha would gently change the subject. Forgiveness, she knew, didn't happen overnight. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. Her father spoke little, but his eyes followed her with quiet guilt. When she poured him tea one morning, he murmured, "You've grown strong, Aisha." She smiled politely, not to boast, but because she knew it was true. Her younger siblings, now teenagers, clung to her every word. They asked her about Mombasa, her job, her apartment by the beach. To them, she was no longer just the big sister who cooked and scolded. She was someone who had built a life on her own. They looked at her with admiration, realizing that she had carried much more than chores. She had been their provider, their comfort, their quiet protector, and they hadn't seen it until now. As Aisha moved through the house, small details reminded everyone of what they had lost when she left. The bills that used to be paid on time were now months behind. The fridge was often empty. The house that once felt warm now seemed colder, even with her there. Her absence had shown them what her presence had been worth. At night, her mother sometimes cried quietly, thinking no one could hear. Aisha did, but she didn't interrupt. She understood that some lessons needed silence to sink in. Her mother's pride had once been too loud, too sharp, but now, that same silence was teaching her humility. One evening, as they sat outside together, her mother finally said, "You were the backbone of this family. We just didn't see it." Aisha nodded gently. "It's okay," she replied softly. "You see it now." A few days later, Aisha told them she would be returning to Mombasa. No one argued. Her mother simply nodded, wiping her tears, and her father gave her a small envelope, a gesture of apology perhaps. Her siblings hugged her tightly, promising to visit. As Aisha packed her bag, the same one she had left with a year before, she looked around the house one last time. It no longer hurt the way it once did. Her absence had spoken louder than her anger ever could. She didn't need to prove her worth anymore. They finally understood. And that quiet understanding was enough. When Aisha returned to Mombasa, everything felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because she had. The same streets, the same ocean breeze, the same walk to work. Yet now, there was a calmness in her she hadn't felt before. She was no longer running from her past or trying to prove anything to anyone. She had faced what hurt her, and she had survived it. Back at her job, everyone noticed the difference in her energy. She spoke with confidence, smiled more often, and carried herself with quiet strength. Her boss, Mr. Lutuli, saw her growth and trusted her with bigger projects. She handled them with grace and focus, becoming known in the company as the woman who could handle anything with patience and heart. As her career grew, so did her desire to help others. She kept thinking about the younger version of herself, scared, tired, and unsure, and how many other young women might be going through the same thing. One evening, sitting by the window of her apartment, she made a decision. She would start a small mentorship program to support young women who had been rejected or misunderstood by their family. It began as a small idea, just weekend meetups in a community hall, a few girls sharing stories over tea. But word spread quickly. Aisha's calm voice, her realness, and her story drew people in. She didn't preach, she listened. She taught them how to budget, how to stay safe, how to build independence without losing hope. She reminded them that walking away from pain didn't mean giving up. It meant choosing peace. Soon, her mentorship program grew into a real initiative. She started partnering with local organizations, arranging workshops, and helping young women find jobs. Seeing them smile again filled her with a kind of joy that no promotion could give. She had turned her pain into purpose, and that became her greatest success. Back in Nairobi, her mother began calling sometimes, short, gentle conversations at first. "Did you eat today?" she would ask, or "How's work?" The tone was softer now, free from control or judgment. And Aisha, no longer the hurt daughter, answered with calm kindness. They didn't talk like mother and child anymore, but like two women who had both been broken and were learning to heal. Sometimes her mother would confess her regrets, saying, "You were right to leave." And Aisha would reply quietly, "We both needed time to grow." There was no blame left between them, just understanding. At night, Aisha would sit by her balcony, watching the waves shimmer under the moonlight, feeling proud of how far she'd come. The peace she once begged for was now something she created, not just for herself, but for others. She had become the woman she always needed, strong, kind, and completely free. The morning light spilled softly through the curtains of Aisha's apartment. The city below was just waking up, the sound of waves in the distance, the hum of traffic, the smell of fresh bread from the street bakery. Aisha stood on her balcony, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the sun rise slowly over Mombasa. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold, and for a moment, everything felt still. She took a deep breath and smiled, the kind of smile that comes after years of storms. Her life hadn't been easy. She had walked through pain, loneliness, and endless nights of doubt, but somehow all of it had led her here. This peace, this quiet strength, was her victory. In her mind, she could still hear her mother's voice from that night long ago. "If you don't like it here, then never come back." Those words had once broken her, but now they no longer hurt. They had simply pushed her toward the life she was meant to build. As the sun rose higher, her voice seemed to echo softly, like a thought carried by the wind. "They told me never to come back, so I walked away. But my silence spoke for me. I didn't need revenge. I just needed peace." She sipped her tea and let the warmth settle in her chest. Behind her, her phone buzzed with messages, work emails, friends checking in, a text from her mother that simply said, "Good morning, my daughter." Aisha smiled again, a tear glistening in her eye. The camera would fade out here, her standing quietly against the golden light, strong and free. And the words would linger long after the screen went black. Sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all.